it's really the idea of leadership and change and the intersection of the two. I went through a career that spanned a period of time when the U.S. military changed. I also went through a period that was tumultuous for U.S. history, and so we underwent a number of pressures and strains and evolutions. And then I, as a person, went through the natural growth of an individual who happened to hit a number of periods in which I got access to leadership that guided me, and I also had opportunities. And so I really think it's how a leader evolves under that sort of unique condition. Sure. Task Force 714 was, in fact, an organization that was brought together as part U.S. military special operating forces, but also a spectrum of other government agencies that were brought in to be part of this organization focused against al-Qaeda. The biggest fight was against al-Qaeda in Iraq. The real change for me was it was an intersection of a very difficult time historically, a difficult challenge militarily, a difficult challenge organizationally and culturally to bring this span of organizations together. And also, it happened to hit a point in my career when I was senior enough to bring some experience and also to be in charge. The thing that was so different about it was trying to bring all these different organizations with their equities and cultures and personalities together, focus them on a common problem, and achieve what we felt, or we described as shared consciousness and understanding of what we were doing, and shared purpose, a common sense of what winning was. And so that became, for me, a transformational experience because it required that organization, people to change how they operated, and it required me to change how I led. In a traditional environment where you say it's directive in nature, a commander or a leader of any organization can direct people to do things, that's really not a good description of how truly effective organizations work. Even in the military where you say a leader can direct or coerce someone to do something, that's not very powerful in combat where they are more scared of physical harm from the enemy than they are of coercion you can do. Therefore, you actually lead them, you motivate them, and you evoke from them responses and dedication to the cause and to act above and beyond what might be desired. So I think the desire is to take an organization and give it a sense of purpose, give individuals a sense of meaningful contribution, and from that you get great demonstrated loyalty and effectiveness. I think that we talk about sometimes a leader as an iconic figure who directs a culture change or an organizational change because they are so wise and they are so visionary. And that was not my role at all. In fact, what I found is in those places like Joint Special Operations Command where we had to change how we operated, what I really was a facilitator. I created an environment which both pushed for and encouraged, celebrated and rewarded adaptability and change. I was willing to decentralize, give authority and responsibility to people at various levels so they could execute it. And then as that began to work, of course, that became self-reinforcing. The more it worked for what we were trying to do, the more comfortable as a leader I became in doing that. There's some risk involved, but the payoff is much greater. Lots of times when you go to work for a civilian company, they view military members, particularly special operators, as being unique and doing something dramatically different from what they did. But in fact, what I found is the two worlds are much more similar than different. I describe as tongue-in-cheek, I say when you're in a closed military meeting, invariably someone will rap the table and say, if we were a business, we'd go bankrupt. No good business would operate like we would. And yet when I go into civilian companies, what I find is they look around the table and someone raps the table and says the military would never do this. In fact, they're people. And there are people trying to make difficult decisions with embedded cultures in their organization. So the differences are actually very small. And so what I found is what you're at the end of the day trying to do is get people with a sense of shared focus and consciousness on what they're trying to do, try to evoke from them commitment to that, and have them understand as clearly as possible what the the organization's efforts are. Problem solving. Clearly, most veterans come back with leadership experience because even the most junior non-commissioned officer has people they're responsible for, and so basic leadership. But I think the common one that people don't understand is problem solving. Most veterans have been put in situations where the requirement doesn't fit a cookie-cuttered approach. There's not an answer to the problem that's in a manual. There's not an answer that can be provided by a senior leader. If you look at what, particularly in the last decade, our junior leaders have had to do, they've had to deal with communities under stress from insurgent attacks. They've had to help build economic development. They've had to help women get rights. They've had to dig irrigation ditch. They've done all of these things in the context of also fighting, at times, a very difficult kinetic fight. That means even at the fairly junior level, we've got people who have dealt with knotty, unexpected, constantly changing problems, and they've dealt with them effectively. And so I think they bring this confidence and this unconscious competence to any business or task that they take on. I think Secretary Hagel is going to face an obvious challenge, and that is the budget challenge and sequestration. It's trying to do what the nation must do with dramatically reduced resources. As resources in the Department of Defense get constrained, historically that brings out political pressures within Congress, within the services, as people fight for programs or requirements that they feel strongly about. That's one. The second is Secretary Hagel and the entire administration are going to be navigating the years ahead, at least the next 4 years, and they're going to be very difficult in certain areas of the world, particularly areas like Syria and Iran. It is almost for sure we will face an even more difficult next few years in that part of the world, which is along the Sunni-Shia fault line, than we have seen even in the last decade. Instead of us going to the bench and taking a break because we think that this last decade has been very difficult, I think the Secretary of Defense and the people he works with are going to have some really knotty, complex challenges. I think that the future military is going to be under tighter budgets, period. I don't think sequestration will last, but it is a compressed budget already, and I think it will likely be compressed more. I think that what will happen is we'll run into this tension. There will be a desire to build and have enough of certain things, aircraft carriers, fighter wings, bomber wings, that sort of thing, to mitigate threats, risks that come from potential competitors. But yet there's going to be a requirement to change, as you say, to be more mobile, more information-based, more adaptable. The big challenge in the military budget is that people are so expensive. If you go back to a World War II draft army model, very few soldiers were married. The health costs, the pay costs were very, very modest. We went to a very professional military, and it's been wonderfully effective, but it's also very, very expensive. And the cost of military pay and allowances and health care alone will just be dramatically hard to constrain unless you cut the size of the force. The only way to reduce is to continue to cut the size or go to a much lower quality. So I think that will be the tension that I'll have to struggle with. The McChrystal Group is a leadership solutions firm, and what we do is we work with non-defense companies that are trying to improve the way they operate, and not in the sense of an efficiency expert, but in terms of making the organization communicate effectively, develop leaders effectively, do decision-making processes as effectively as they can, and really deal with what is a very fast-moving competitive environment for almost every organization now. In McChrystal Group, we use a model called cross-lead, and really it's based upon some very basic leadership traits and techniques that have been almost common through time, but it also has much more sense of using transparency, pumping information very, very aggressively, doing decision-making in a process that's more inclusive than many organizations. And in fact, you're enabled by technology to do this in ways that was very difficult before. To bring a lot of people together before just wasn't as practical as it can be now. everything from video teleconferences to phones and whatnot. So you can do it. And so what we do is we recommend a balance where you're passing information much more aggressively, being more inclusive in developing that shared consciousness, and then decentralizing authority to execute, because people closest to the problem typically know best. And we find that by developing people, we help leaders develop to do that system. We help companies change processes so they can implement that system. And then we help them understand the greater context to understand how they're going to use that system to be effective. Put yourself in a place where you get some very practical experience. Many of the Kennedy School graduates will go forward and they'll be policymakers someday. I recommend to everybody, get somewhere where the rubber meets the road, where the execution of policy is required, so you can get a tactile sense of what it feels like when it's actually being executed. Policy in its theoretical is interesting. Policy in its execution is messier, difficult, but an important understanding for any long-term policy developer.